Let's get started. Story number 1.
The old farmhouse stood at the edge of a quiet valley, its warped wooden beams creaking under the weight of countless winters. It had been empty for decades, its windows staring blankly like the hollow eyes of a forgotten soul. Locals whispered about the house, trading tales of eerie lights and strange sounds that carried on the wind, but no one dared to step inside. Not until Clara came along. Clara had inherited the property from an estranged aunt she barely remembered. With a failing relationship and mounting stress in her city life, she saw the house as a chance to start fresh. The moment she set foot on the overgrown path leading to the door, a chill prickled her skin despite the warmth of the late summer afternoon. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying a faint odor of damp wood and something sharper like rusted iron. The house had been left as if her aunt had just stepped out, with a faded armchair sagging in the corner and a cold, blackened hearth dominating the living room. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was intruding, but she shook it off as nerves. Over the first few days, Clara cleaned and unpacked, trying to make the place feel like home. But the house had its quirks. At night, she heard faint creaks and shuffles, as though someone was pacing just outside her bedroom door. The first time it happened, she dismissed it as the house settling. By the third night, she was no longer so sure. On the fifth night, the sound of footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. They stopped just outside her room. Heart pounding, Clara grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open, but the hallway was empty. The floorboards, however, were warm beneath her bare feet, as if someone had been standing there only moments ago. Determined not to let her imagination get the best of her, Clara began exploring the house during daylight hours, hoping to uncover some logical explanation. In the attic, she found an old trunk filled with photographs and letters. The images were faded, but one face appeared again and again, a pale woman with hollow eyes and a stern expression. Clara's stomach churned when she realized the woman bore a striking resemblance to her late aunt. One letter, written in a spidery hand, caught Clara's attention. The ink was smudged, but she could make out phrases like, "wronged, cannot forgive," and "she always returns." A strange unease settled over her as she read. It felt as though the words were not meant for her, as though they were meant to warn someone long gone. That night, Clara dreamed of the woman in the photographs. In her dream, the woman stood at the foot of her bed, her translucent face twisted with fury. Clara tried to scream, but found herself paralyzed, her throat locked in terror. When she woke, her sheets were soaked with sweat, and the faint scent of roses lingered in the air. An impossible detail, as there were no flowers anywhere on the property. As the days turned into weeks, the activity in the house escalated. Objects moved on their own. Books slid off shelves, chairs scraped across the floor, and lights flickered even when there was no storm. One night, Clara awoke to find her bedroom door wide open. She distinctly remembered locking it before bed. At the end of the hallway, she saw a shadowy figure. It didn't move, but she felt its gaze pierce her like an icicle. Clara tried to leave the house the next morning, but her car refused to start. Her phone had no signal, though it had worked fine the day before. It was as if the house had wrapped itself around her, trapping her within its rotting walls. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara decided to confront whatever was haunting her. Armed with a flashlight and the iron poker from the fireplace, she descended into the basement, where she had always felt the cold presence the strongest. The basement was a maze of cobwebs and crumbling stone walls, her breath fogged in the frigid air. In the far corner, she found an old wooden door she hadn't noticed before. It was padlocked, but the wood was so brittle that it gave way with a few sharp blows from the poker. Behind the door was a small, windowless room. In the center of the room stood a single chair, and on it sat the faint outline of a woman. Clara froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The figure turned slowly toward her, and for the first time, Clara saw the woman's face clearly. It was the woman from the photographs, but her eyes burned with an unnatural light, and her lips twisted into a malevolent grin. Before Clara could move, the figure lunged at her, dissolving into a frigid wind that knocked her to the ground. The room erupted into chaos. Screams filled the air, though no one was there to make them, and the walls seemed to pulse as if alive. Clara fled up the stairs, her flashlight forgotten. When she reached the living room, she stopped dead. The armchair was no longer empty. The woman sat there, staring into the cold hearth. Slowly, she turned her head to look at Clara. "Leave," the woman rasped, her voice like the scrape of nails on stone. "You are not welcome here." Clara didn't need to be told twice. She bolted out the door and into the night, running until her legs gave out. She never returned to the farmhouse, and when she told her story to the locals, they simply nodded knowingly. Months later, Clara learned that the house had been destroyed in a fire. The cause was never determined, but some claimed to see a pale woman standing in the flames, watching as the house collapsed around her. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be just another quiet weekend in the countryside. Emma had rented a cabin deep in the woods, far away from the city, to clear her mind after a brutal breakup. She needed solitude, a place where no one could bother her, and this little wooden cabin tucked behind a wall of towering pine trees seemed perfect. The cabin was rustic but charming, with a stone fireplace and creaky wooden floors. A small lake glistened nearby, and the surrounding forest was alive with birdsong. Emma couldn't ask for more. It was peaceful, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of calm. That first evening, as she sat by the fire with a glass of wine, she noticed something odd. A faint sound like a soft tapping came from the window behind her. Turning, she saw nothing but the dark forest reflected in the glass. She dismissed it as a branch brushing against the window and returned to her book. The tapping came again, this time louder and more deliberate. Emma stood and walked to the window. She peered out into the darkness, but her flashlight revealed only trees swaying gently in the breeze. Shaking her head, she locked the window and pulled the curtains closed. "It's nothing," she muttered to herself. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she was startled awake by the sound of footsteps. They weren't outside. They were in the house. Heavy, deliberate steps echoed down the hallway just outside her room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for her phone. The time read 3:12 a.m. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Emma held her breath, straining to listen, but there was nothing, just the faint creak of the house settling. She spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching her phone like a lifeline. When morning finally came, she tried to convince herself it had been a dream, or maybe a trick of her imagination. After all, she was in an unfamiliar place, alone in the woods. It was natural to feel uneasy. But as the day wore on, the feeling of being watched persisted. Every time Emma glanced out the window, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of a shadow, a flash of pale skin. But when she looked again, there was nothing there. She told herself it was her nerves, her mind playing tricks, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma decided to shake off her fear. She lit a fire in the hearth, made herself a cup of tea, and curled up on the couch with a blanket. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and for a moment she felt almost normal again, until the knocking started. It wasn't the soft tapping from the night before. This was loud, insistent, and it came from the front door. Emma froze, her heart racing. Who could possibly be at her door this late? She grabbed her phone and crept to the door, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. Her hand trembled as she slowly unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The porch was empty, the forest beyond silent and still. She stepped outside, shining her flashlight into the darkness. "Hello?" she called out. Her voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the night. As she turned to go back inside, something caught her eye, a set of wet footprints leading up to the porch. They were bare, human footprints, and they ended abruptly at her door. Emma's blood ran cold. She slammed the door shut, bolted it, and double-checked all the windows. The knocking didn't return that night, but Emma barely slept. She lay awake, every creak and groan of the old house setting her nerves on edge. By morning, she was exhausted but determined to leave. She packed her bags and loaded her car, eager to put the whole eerie experience behind her. But the car wouldn't start. She turned the key again and again, but the engine refused to turn over. Frustrated and scared, she grabbed her phone to call for help, only to find that she had no signal. Emma stared at the lifeless device in disbelief. She hadn't noticed any signal issues when she'd arrived. It was as if something didn't want her to leave. As the day wore on, Emma tried to distract herself. She read, walked by the lake, and avoided looking too closely at the woods. But as the sun began to set, her unease grew. She lit every light in the cabin and kept the fireplace roaring, determined to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. That night, the knocking returned, louder and more frantic than before. It came not just from the front door, but from the windows, the walls, even the roof. It surrounded her, relentless and terrifying. Emma sat frozen on the couch, clutching the fireplace poker like a weapon. "Who's there?" she screamed, her voice cracking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the corner of the room, she heard it, a low, guttural whisper. "Emma." Her name, spoken in a voice that was not quite human. It sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She spun around, but the corner was empty. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Emma." She ran to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. The whispering followed, growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't just her name now. It was a cacophony of voices, overlapping and indistinct, rising to a deafening roar. She pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was worse. It was heavy, suffocating, and in it Emma felt something, someone, standing just outside her door. She didn't dare move. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she fell into a restless sleep. When she woke, the house was eerily quiet. The morning light streamed through the windows, and for a moment, she wondered if it had all been a nightmare. But the marks on her bedroom door told a different story. Deep, jagged scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. Emma left the cabin that day, abandoning her belongings and walking the long, winding road back to the nearest town. She never told anyone the full story of what happened, and she never went back to the woods. Years later, she heard that the cabin had burned down. The cause of the fire was never determined, but locals claim they still heard knocking in the woods at night and whispers carried on the wind. Story. The end.
Story number 3.
It was late October when Paul and Rachel moved into the house on Ash Hollow Road. It wasn't exactly their dream home, run down and neglected, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds, but it was all they could afford. They were young, in love, and ready to make the best of it. Besides, Rachel loved old houses, and Paul had assured her that they could fix it up in no time. The first couple of days were spent unpacking and settling in. The house creaked and groaned like an old ship, but Rachel thought it added to the charm. The only thing that unnerved her was the basement. It was damp, cold, and smelled faintly of mildew. Something about it felt wrong, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "Nothing a little cleaning can't fix," Paul had said with a shrug when she mentioned it. But on their third night in the house, Rachel woke to the sound of a faint humming. It was soft and melodic, coming from somewhere below. She nudged Paul awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He groaned and turned over. "It's probably just the pipes," he mumbled before drifting back to sleep. Rachel wasn't convinced. She lay awake, listening until the humming faded. The next morning, she decided to check the basement. Armed with a flashlight, she descended the creaky wooden stairs. The air was colder down there, and the smell of mildew was stronger. The basement was mostly empty, except for a few dusty boxes and an old wooden wardrobe pushed against the far wall. The wardrobe was out of place, like it didn't belong there. It was tall, with ornate carvings of vines and flowers winding up its doors. Rachel hesitated, then opened it. Inside was empty, save for a small dusty mirror leaning against the back wall. The glass was cracked, but as she looked at it, a chill ran down her spine. For a moment, she thought she saw something moving behind her in the reflection. She spun around, but the basement was empty. When she told Paul about it, he laughed. "It's an old house, Rach. Of course it feels creepy. You're just letting your imagination run wild." Rachel wanted to believe him, but that night, the humming returned. This time it was louder, and it didn't sound like pipes. It was a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, singing a tune that made the hairs on Rachel's arms stand on end. She sat up in bed, staring at the doorway, expecting to see someone standing there, but no one came. The next day, Rachel asked the neighbors about the house. Most were friendly but vague, saying they didn't know much about it, except for Mrs. Abbott, the elderly woman who lived next door. She hesitated when Rachel brought up the house, then leaned in close. "They never told you, did they?" "Mrs." Abbott's voice was barely above a whisper. "About the girl?" "What girl?" Rachel asked, her heart sinking. Mrs. Abbott sighed. "Years ago, a family lived there. They had a daughter, young and pretty. But one day she vanished, just disappeared. Some folks say she ran off, but others..." She trailed off, her eyes darting toward Rachel's house. "Well, others say she never left." Rachel felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Abbott hesitated, then whispered, "They say she's still there, waiting." That evening, Rachel told Paul what she'd learned. He brushed it off, calling it small-town gossip. "People love to make up stories about old houses," he said. "It doesn't mean anything." But that night, the humming returned. It was louder than ever, and this time it was accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps, soft, shuffling steps that echoed through the house. Rachel grabbed Paul's arm, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" she hissed. Paul sat up, frowning. The sound of footsteps continued, growing louder. "What the hell?" he muttered, climbing out of bed. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the stairs, Rachel close behind him. The footsteps seemed to be coming from the basement. Paul hesitated at the top of the stairs, then began to descend. Rachel followed, her heart pounding in her chest. At the bottom of the stairs, the humming stopped. The silence was deafening. Paul swept the flashlight around the basement, illuminating the boxes, the cracked walls, and finally the wardrobe. "Is that open?" Rachel whispered. The wardrobe door, which Rachel was certain she had closed, was now ajar. Paul approached it cautiously, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. He swung the door open, revealing the empty interior. Except it wasn't empty. The cracked mirror was still there, but now the glass seemed darker, almost black. Rachel stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone, and then a face appeared. It was a young woman, pale and gaunt, her dark hair hanging in wet strands around her face. Her eyes were wide and filled with sorrow, but her mouth twisted into a scream, silent but so visceral that Rachel stumbled backward, clutching Paul's arm. The light flickered and the room grew impossibly cold. The figure in the mirror reached out, her hand pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. Paul grabbed Rachel and pulled her up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind them. They didn't sleep that night. The humming continued, louder and more mournful, echoing through the house like a lament. By morning, they had made up their minds to leave. But as they packed their things, the house seemed to resist. Doors wouldn't open, windows wouldn't budge, and the air grew heavy, suffocating. The humming turned into wailing, filling every corner of the house. In a desperate attempt to escape, Paul grabbed a hammer and smashed the front window. They climbed out, leaving their belongings behind, and didn't stop running until they reached the main road. They never returned to the house on Ash Hollow Road. Months later, Rachel learned that it had been condemned and demolished, but sometimes when she's alone, she swears she can still hear the humming. Soft, sorrowful, and unrelenting. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The house on Willow Creek Road had always been a part of small-town legend. The two-story Victorian stood isolated on a hill, its chipped paint and shattered windows a testament to years of abandonment. People whispered that it was haunted, but no one could say for sure. The stories varied. Some claimed to see lights flickering in the upstairs windows, others swore they heard laughter when the wind blew just right. But no one dared to stay long enough to find out. Until Sam did. Sam wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. A skeptic through and through, he laughed off the warnings when he purchased the house for an absurdly low price. He saw potential, not curses. A fixer-upper with history, not horror. Sam was a contractor by trade, and with a little elbow grease, he planned to turn the decaying relic into a profitable rental. He moved in with nothing but a mattress, some tools, and a box of essentials. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. No cars passed. No crickets chirped. Just the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint groan of the house as it settled. Sam chalked it up to the isolation and the fact that old houses always made noise. It wasn't until the second night that things began to feel off. Sam had been working late, patching up holes in the living room walls. The work was tedious, and he barely noticed the time slipping away. At some point, he heard what sounded like footsteps on the floor above him. slow, deliberate creaks that moved from one end of the house to the other. He froze, his hammer mid-swing. His logical mind told him it was the house settling, or maybe a raccoon that had snuck in through a broken window. Grabbing his flashlight, Sam climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under his weight. The upstairs hallway was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and old wood. Sam checked each room, shining his flashlight into the corners. Nothing. No raccoon, no signs of anyone, or anything, there. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. By the time he returned downstairs, the house felt different. The air was colder and there was a faint smell of something metallic, like rust or blood. Sam shook his head, blaming his overactive imagination. He locked up for the night and went to bed. The next morning, Sam woke to find the hammer he'd left in the living room sitting on the kitchen counter. He didn't remember moving it, but he figured he must have done so without thinking. Still, unease crept into his thoughts. Was he becoming paranoid? Over the next few days, the disturbances grew. At night, he heard whispers, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. His tools frequently went missing, only to reappear in strange places. The bathroom sink, the front porch, even the attic. And always there was the sound of footsteps above him, pacing, stopping, starting again. Sam decided to do some research. He drove into town and stopped at the library, sifting through old newspapers and public records. That's when he found the story. In 1912, the house had belonged to the Whitaker family, a husband, wife, and their young daughter, Margaret. One winter evening, the family vanished without a trace. Neighbors reported seeing the Whitakers at church earlier that day, but by nightfall, the house was silent. Days passed before anyone thought to check on them. When they did, they found the house empty, the family's belongings untouched, the fireplace still warm. Margaret's small handmade doll was discovered in the middle of the living room floor. Its eyes, one newspaper article noted, had been gouged out. Sam shivered, but he told himself it was just a tragic story, nothing more. Yet, as he drove back to the house, he couldn't shake the image of the doll, and when he stepped through the front door, it felt as though the house was waiting for him. That night, the whispers were louder. Sam lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling as the voices swirled around him. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. When the footsteps began again, this time on the stairs, he bolted upright. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty house. The footsteps stopped. Heart pounding, Sam grabbed his flashlight and descended the stairs. The living room was empty, just as he'd left it. But as he turned to go back upstairs, something caught his eye. In the center of the room, on the dusty wooden floor, was a small doll. It hadn't been there before. Sam's breath hitched. The doll was old, its fabric body faded and torn. One of its button eyes was missing, and the other hung loosely by a thread. It was Margaret's doll. He was sure of it. He backed away, his mind racing. The metallic smell returned, stronger this time, and the air grew frigid. The whispers intensified, surrounding him, pressing in. Sam clutched his head, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. And then silence. Sam opened his eyes to find himself standing in the center of the living room, the doll still at his feet. But something was different. The air felt heavier, and the room seemed darker, as if the walls had closed in. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision. He turned, but nothing was there. The whispers began again, soft at first, then rising to a crescendo. They seemed to be coming from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. "Leave," a voice rasped, cutting through the chaos. It was low and guttural, filled with anger. Sam didn't wait to hear it again. He bolted for the front door, throwing it open and sprinting into the night. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck. The engine roared to life, and he sped away, gravel crunching under the tires. He never returned to the house on Willow Creek Road. Weeks later, the property was put back on the market, but no one else seemed eager to buy it. Sam told himself it didn't matter, that he didn't believe in ghosts. But every so often, when he's alone at night, he swears he hears the sound of footsteps pacing above him. Story the end.
Story number 5.
When Claire's grandmother passed away, she left Claire something she hadn't expected, an old family farmhouse in a remote part of the countryside. The house had been in their family for generations, but no one had lived there for over 30 years. Claire had visited it only once as a child, and her memories were hazy. A sprawling white house with peeling paint, an overgrown garden, and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. It felt strange inheriting the house, but Claire had no other family to consult. With her job allowing her to work remotely, she decided to take a few weeks to visit and see if the place could be salvaged or sold. It seemed like a peaceful escape from her tiny apartment in the city. When Claire arrived, the house was exactly as she remembered, worn, weathered, and unsettlingly quiet. The front door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and the smell of must and damp wood hit her immediately. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through broken curtains, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. There was something about the house that felt heavy, like the walls held secrets they weren't ready to share. She spent the first day unpacking and cleaning. Most of the furniture was still there, covered in yellowed sheets. Upstairs, she found an old rocking chair in one of the bedrooms, its seat worn smooth with use. It faced a large window overlooking the backyard, thus where an ancient oak tree stood. For reasons she couldn't explain, the chair made her uneasy, so she draped a blanket over it and closed the door. That night, Claire lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the old house settling. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the faint hoot of an owl. She drifted off, but a noise woke her in the middle of the night. It was faint at first, like a rhythmic creaking. She thought it was just the wind. But as she lay still, her heart beating in her ears, she realized it was coming from upstairs. It was the distinct sound of a rocking chair moving back and forth. Claire froze. The blanket she had thrown over the chair earlier flashed in her mind. Had she imagined doing that? Was it possible she'd forgotten? No, she was certain. She had covered it. The creaking continued, slow and steady, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she mustered the courage to leave her room, armed with her phone flashlight. She climbed the stairs, every step amplifying the sound. The door to the bedroom with the rocking chair was ajar, just slightly. Pushing it open, she aimed her flashlight at the chair. It was moving, rocking slowly on its worn runners. The blanket she'd placed over it was now crumpled on the floor. Claire's breath hitched. She stood frozen, staring at the chair, unable to move. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air felt thick and cold, pressing in on her from all sides. Claire backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. The next morning, she convinced herself it was just her imagination. The wind must have moved the chair, she thought, or maybe she hadn't draped the blanket securely. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Lights flickered despite the wiring having been recently checked. Doors she knew she'd closed were found open. And then there were the whispers. Late at night, Claire swore she could hear faint voices coming from the walls, too soft to make out the words, but unmistakable in their presence. She decided to explore the attic, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain the strange occurrences. The attic door was stiff, and it took her several tries to pry it open. The stairs groaned as she ascended, her flashlight illuminating cobwebs and forgotten relics of the past. In the corner of the attic, beneath a heavy layer of dust, she found a wooden chest. It was locked, but the hinges were old and brittle. With a bit of effort, she pried it open. Inside were photographs, yellowed letters, and a small, tattered doll with glass eyes that seemed to follow her as she moved. The photographs showed a family, her grandmother as a young girl, her great-grandparents, and a boy Claire didn't recognize. The boy appeared in several pictures, always standing a little apart from the rest of the family, his expression blank. One photograph caught her attention, the boy sitting in the very same rocking chair, staring directly into the camera. Claire's stomach churned. She sifted through the letters, her hands shaking. Most were mundane, but one, dated 1927, stood out. It was addressed to her great-grandmother from someone named Eleanor, pleading with her to take the boy away. The letter spoke of strange behaviors, sleepless nights, and a chilling line. "The house has taken him. He is not himself anymore." Claire's blood ran cold. The boy's name wasn't mentioned again, and the letters stopped abruptly after that date. What had happened to him? Why was his presence erased from the family history? That night, the rocking chair moved again, louder this time, as if someone was slamming it back and forth. Claire stayed in her room, too terrified to investigate. But then she heard the footsteps, slow and deliberate. They moved down the hallway toward her door. She held her breath, gripping her phone tightly. The footsteps stopped right outside her room. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn. "No," she whispered, backing away. "No, no, no." That the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. But the cold rushed in, wrapping around her like icy hands. And in the corner of the room, she saw him, the boy from the photographs. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes dark and hollow. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at her with an intensity that made her legs buckle. Claire screamed, bolting from the room and out of the house. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, fumbling to start it with shaking hands. She drove away, leaving everything behind. She never returned to the farmhouse. Months later, it was sold at auction. But sometimes when Claire closes her eyes, she sees the boy standing in the corner of her room, his lifeless gaze fixed on her. And every now and then, in the dead of night, she still hears the faint creak of a rocking chair. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The storm had been relentless that evening, soaking the narrow, winding roads that led to the old inn nestled deep in the forest. Jenna hadn't planned to stop, but when her car's engine sputtered and died, she had little choice. The inn seemed like a godsend, its dimly lit sign flickering against the backdrop of the pouring rain. Haven's Rest? Vacancies. She grabbed her coat, her overnight bag, and her phone, which was now down to 5% battery, and made a dash for the entrance. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic filling her nose. A woman stood behind the counter, her pale face illuminated by the soft glow of a single desk lamp. "Need a room?" the woman asked, her voice polite but distant. "Yes, please," Jenna replied, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. The woman handed her a key with the number 7 etched onto the brass tag. "End of the hall, second floor," she said, barely making eye contact. Jenna noticed that the woman's hands trembled slightly as she passed the key. "Thank you," Jenna said, but the woman didn't respond, already turning back to the ledger on the counter. Jenna climbed the narrow staircase, her footsteps echoing in the empty inn. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, the floral patterns peeling in places. The place felt old, forgotten. She reached her room, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was modest, just a bed, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the dark forest. The rain hammered against the glass, and the wind howled, rattling the panes. She threw her bag onto the bed and sighed. She would call for roadside assistance in the morning when her phone had charged. For now, she just needed sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. As she lay in the creaky bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought she heard faint noises, whispers, so soft she couldn't make out the words. She dismissed it as her imagination, chalking it up to the storm and her exhaustion. But then, there was a sound she couldn't ignore. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, pacing back and forth in the hallway outside her door. Jenna sat up, her heart racing. She checked the time on her phone, 1:47 a.m. She waited, straining her ears, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. Trying to shake off the unease, Jenna lay back down. But just as she was beginning to drift off, she heard it again. The sound of someone walking, this time closer to her door. She held her breath as the footsteps stopped directly outside her room. Her stomach tightened as she watched the doorknob slowly begin to turn. It jiggled once, twice, but the door remained locked. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Jenna grabbed her phone and rushed to the door, pressing her ear against it. She heard nothing now. No footsteps, no voices, just the pounding rain outside. Gathering her courage, she unlocked the door and yanked it open. The hallway was empty. "Great," she muttered, shutting the door and locking it again. "Just what I need, a creepy inn in the middle of nowhere." But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. She decided to charge her phone for a few minutes to feel more secure. Digging through her bag, she plugged it into the wall and waited. The room felt colder now, the air heavy and oppressive. Jenna froze when she noticed something in the reflection of the window. A figure, tall and shadowy, was standing behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her breathing quickened, and she backed toward the door, keeping her eyes on the spot where the figure had been. Her mind raced. Had she imagined it? Was it a trick of the storm's light? Before she could decide what to do, there was a loud knock at her door. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she approached the door, her hand hovering over the handle. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. No response. She took a deep breath and opened the door. The hallway was empty again, but now something felt different. The air was colder, and the faint smell of burnt wood lingered. She glanced down the hall and saw something that made her blood run cold. A series of wet footprints leading from her door, disappearing into the darkness at the far end of the corridor. She slammed the door shut and backed away, grabbing her phone. It had only charged to 10%, but it would have to do. She decided she couldn't stay another minute. She shoved her belongings into her bag and reached for the door, but before she could open it, a low whisper filled the room. "Stay." The voice was soft but commanding, as though it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Jenna froze, clutching the doorknob. She turned her head slowly, and what she saw made her scream. The shadowy figure was standing in the corner of the room now, its shape clearer. It was tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured but its hollow eyes fixed on her. The figure took a step toward her, and the lights flickered violently. Jenna yanked the door open and bolted down the hall, not daring to look back. She stumbled down the stairs and into the lobby, but the desk was empty. The woman from earlier was nowhere to be found. The front door, too, was locked. Desperate, Jenna pounded on it, screaming for help. Behind her, she heard the slow, deliberate footsteps descending the staircase. She didn't turn around. With a burst of adrenaline, she grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it against the glass of the front door, shattering it. She climbed through the jagged opening, cutting her arm in the process, and ran into the storm. She didn't stop running until she reached a gas station a few miles down the road. The clerk called the police, and they escorted her back to the inn to retrieve her belongings. But when they arrived, the building was dark and boarded up, its windows covered in grime. "This can't be right," Jenna said, her voice shaking. "I was just here." The officer gave her a puzzled look. "Miss, this place has been abandoned for years." Jenna insisted they check inside, and reluctantly they pried open the front door. The interior was dilapidated, covered in dust and cobwebs. But when they climbed to the second floor, they found her room, door slightly ajar, her bag still sitting on the bed, and on the floor, smeared into the dust, were the words, "You shouldn't have left." Jenna never returned to that stretch of road, and to this day, she can't explain what happened at Haven's Rest. But sometimes when the rain pounds against her apartment windows, she swears she hears those footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The small lakeside town of Ash Hollow was the kind of place people drove through without stopping. Nestled between thick woods and a still, dark lake, it felt forgotten, shrouded in perpetual mist. For Lisa, it was the perfect place to spend a few quiet weeks. She'd been working long hours at her job in the city, and her therapist had insisted on a vacation. When she stumbled upon the listing for an old, secluded cabin on the lake, she booked it immediately. The cabin was charming in a rustic, slightly worn way. It had a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and a creaky porch that overlooked the lake. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Barlow, had handed her the keys without much conversation. "Enjoy your stay," he said before pausing, his expression turning somber. "Just don't go out on the lake at night." Lisa had laughed nervously. "Why not?" "Fog rolls in thick," Mr. Barlow said. "Easy to get lost. Dangerous out there." She nodded, brushing off the warning as a typical small-town superstition. But as she unpacked and settled in, she couldn't shake the unease in his voice. The first few days were uneventful. Lisa spent her mornings reading on the porch and her afternoons exploring the nearby trails. At night, she listened to the sounds of the lake, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustling of the trees in the breeze. It was peaceful, exactly what she needed. On the fourth night, Lisa woke to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like someone humming a tune just out of earshot. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, clearer, a soft, lilting melody that seemed to drift across the lake. She went to the window, her breath fogging up the glass. The lake was calm, bathed in the silvery glow of the moon, but she could see nothing unusual. She told herself it was just the wind or a trick of her half-asleep mind and went back to bed. But the humming continued, weaving its way into her dreams, haunting her even as she slept. The next morning, Lisa ventured into town to pick up some groceries. She mentioned the sound to the clerk at the store, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a wary smile. The woman's expression darkened. "You heard it, huh?" "Heard what?" Lisa asked. The clerk leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "They say the lake is haunted. Folks around here call it the siren song. People who hear it are drawn to it. They go out on the water and never come back." Lisa laughed, trying to mask her unease. "That's just a story, right?" The woman shrugged. "Maybe, but I'd stay off the lake if I were you." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lisa sat on the porch, staring out at the water. The story lingered in her mind, but she dismissed it as local folklore. Still, when the humming began again, she felt a chill creep down her spine. This time it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, carrying a mournful tune across the water. Lisa stepped off the porch, her bare feet sinking into the cool grass as she moved closer to the lake. The sound seemed to wrap around her, pulling her forward. She stopped at the edge of the water, her heart pounding. The lake was shrouded in a thin layer of fog, and the moonlight danced on its surface. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and Lisa felt an overwhelming urge to step into the water. She shook her head, snapping herself out of the trance. "Get a grip," she muttered, backing away. She locked the cabin door that night and forced herself to stay in bed, even as the humming continued. The next day, she resolved to ignore it. She kept herself busy with books and long walks, but as night fell, the humming returned, relentless and haunting. By the fifth night, it was no longer just humming. Lisa could hear faint whispers interspersed with the melody, beckoning her. "Come, join us." Her dreams were filled with images of the lake, dark and endless, and shadowy figures just beneath the surface, their eyes glowing faintly in the depths. Lisa decided she needed answers. She drove back into town and sought out Mr. Barlow. When she asked him about the lake, he looked at her with a mix of pity and fear. "You've heard it," he said, more a statement than a question. She nodded. "What is it?" he sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's been happening for as long as anyone can remember. People hear the song and they feel compelled. Some say it's the spirits of those who've drowned. Others think it's something older, something that doesn't belong in this world. Whatever it is, it wants to pull you in." Lisa felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Why didn't you warn me?" "I did," he said quietly. "I told you to stay off the lake at night." That evening, Lisa sat on the porch, staring at the still waters, determined to resist the call. But as the night deepened, the song returned, louder than ever. This time, it wasn't just outside. It seemed to echo inside her head, filling every corner of her mind. "Come to us." She tried to block it out, covering her ears, but it was no use. The pull was stronger now, almost unbearable. She grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, shouting at the lake. "What do you want? Leave me alone." The only response was the melody, growing softer, more sorrowful. And then, for the first time, Lisa saw something. In the fog hovering above the water, faint figures began to appear. They were indistinct at first, like shadows, but as they drew closer, she could make out faces, pale, sunken, and hauntingly beautiful. They were women, their long hair flowing like dark tendrils around them, their eyes glowing faintly in the mist. One of them extended a hand toward her, and Lisa felt an overwhelming urge to step forward. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But the figures didn't disappear. They lingered, their expressions mournful yet enticing. The song swelled, and Lisa felt her resolve weakening. She took a step toward the water, her mind screaming at her to stop, but her body felt beyond her control. Suddenly, a loud crack of thunder jolted her back to reality. The fog dissipated, and the figures vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Lisa stumbled back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and collapsing onto the floor. The next morning, she packed her things and left. She didn't stop to say goodbye to Mr. Barlow or anyone else in town. As she drove away, the lake disappeared in her rearview mirror, but the song stayed with her, echoing in her mind. Even now, back in the city, Lisa can't escape it. On quiet nights, when the wind is still and the world feels empty, she hears the faint hum of a melody, beckoning her back to the lake. Story, the end.